AP students, this is Mrs. Politsky, and we're going to do notes for Chapter 11, talking about how intelligence is measured. So as we go along, you may want to have your PowerPoint copies handy, and there may be some additional notes that you may want to take as we're going along here. So we're going to talk a little bit about how intelligence is measured, and eventually we're going to get into kind of the rise of the intelligence test and talking a little bit about the quotient. And before we wrap up this section, we're also going to talk a little bit about exceptional children, and those would be individuals who have some form of mental disabilities such as mental retardation, or those people who are possibly on the opposite end of the spectrum, talking about giftedness. So here we go. We're going to talk to begin with, as far as we're concerned here, about how intelligence is measured. And, one of the things that I want you to understand is that, intelligence is kind of a controversial subject. The fact that for years it has been used to kind of categorize people, and in some cases unfairly. So, one of the things that we need to know is that intelligence involves the abilities to acquire knowledge, to acquire reason, to solve problems. But it's not always going to be measured in a verbal way. It could be measured in non-verbal ways. And so we need to kind of keep that in the back of our minds, because there was a time then that when we look at the history of the rise of IQ tests, that we were pretty much focused on like verbal abilities and mathematical reasoning. And there's a little bit more to it than that. So we're going to start with the man who's kind of credited, or the men who are kind of credited for bringing us this whole concept of an intelligence test. You got to start with Alfred Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon. Around 1904, we're trying to figure out a way to kind of test students in the country of France. France at this point in time had passed a comprehensive education law that required that all students who are of a certain age attend school. And the idea was trying to figure out where students should be placed as far as grades and who needed help. And so Binet and Simon came up with this test, and it only had roughly 30 problems, and it would sample a variety of different abilities. And this test would be used to predict whether or not a student could or could not handle what would be identified as normal schoolwork. There were basically four features. The idea was that this test would be an estimate of an individual's current performance. It would help identify students who needed special needs or had special needs. It would help with the training and opportunities that would affect intelligence. And this test itself was also very empirical. In other words, it was a very reasoned test, very scientifically designed, based on how children were observed to perform, rather than trying to test a particular theory, so to speak. Okay, a lot of these scores were expressed in terms. Okay, and a couple of the terms that come up in this Binet-Simon test that you can kind of see here is the idea of a mental age, how it compares to a chronological age. A mental age is kind of the age that an individual student, that the level of work that they could work up to. Okay, whereas their chronological age is their actual age at that moment, their birth age. Okay, as we go along, intelligence testing really caught on, not only in Europe, but here in the United States. And the United States started using it as a way to kind of assess our young people who, by the early 20th century, we also had compulsory educational laws here in the United States, and we needed to figure out where students needed to be in the classroom as far as that was concerned. We also had a huge wave of immigration, and that in itself probably had a lot to do with this whole idea of trying to gauge intelligence, and some of it could have had kind of sinister uh, aftertones because of the fact that it was kind of believed that certain immigrants coming from perhaps maybe Eastern Europe or Southern Europe were inferior to those that were coming from Western Europe or Northern Europe. So nevertheless, you had a little bit of that. And then the military. You know, early 20th century, we had a few wars. We had World War I and World War II, and the military needed a way of assessing and classifying these new recruits. And in basically the First World War, we came up with what was known as the Army Alpha, Army Beta test. Army Alpha test and Army Beta tests were set up in such a way for individual recruits who were literate and those who were non-literate individuals. And what it would do is it would kind of give the military an idea of maybe uh, what would be probably the best, um, occupation within the military that these individuals could obtain. One thing that we do know is that, some of these tests were, a little biased, and it kind of helped reinforce certain prejudices that existed in this country. And that's kind of the dark side of intelligence in this country, is that it has been used at times against people rather than helping them. Okay, leading us further into the 20th century, we have what would be kind of the gold standard of IQ tests for many, many decades, and that would be the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale. Um, Binet, we had heard about Alfred Binet in France. Um, at the University of Stanford in California, we had a professor named Louis Terman. Terman took some of Binet's principles and he kind of tweaked them, and eventually we get the Stanford Binet scale. Terman introduced the concept of the IQ, or the intelligence quotient. He didn't necessarily come up with this. I mean, matter of fact, it's documented that the whole term of an IQ is really coined, or was coined by a man named William Stern back in 1914, who was a psychologist out of Germany. But the idea is that you would do a ratio of mental age, or MA, to the chronological age, CA. You would divide those and then multiply them by 100. And supposedly, that would give you a quotient. Okay, a number that for the most part is based from 0 to roughly about 200. Um, this would actually look like a norm curve or a bell curve, and 100 would be kind of right in the middle of all the scores. This became a very, very popular tool as far as how we're going to assess students and really all people in general. So you can kind of see here a little bit of the formula itself and how it's calculated. Um, we have we have kind of used this as the gold standard. And one thing that we need to know is that there are objections to it. The fact that it sometimes is inconsistent. Not everyone is very verbal. We have those people who are incredibly intelligent, who are basically nonverbal people, that they are able to see things and to manipulate things in such a way that, you know, perhaps maybe they're not being tested on. So, one thing that I want to talk about is this idea of our exceptional children. And one of the things that we know out of that intelligence quotient is that there was a certain portion of the population that scored, you know, kind of in the lower and the higher ranges. Typically, there is um, kind of a norm where 100 is right in the middle. Typically, most people in the population score somewhere between 30 points, above or below that. But then there are those exceptions that score below 70 and score above 130. So we're going to talk a little bit about mental retardation. And these are usually those individuals who represent the lower 2% of the IQ range. Typically, those people who score below 70 on the IQ test. Um, One thing that we know is that, even for individuals who score below 70, is that there's different breakoffs as far as ability, and there are those people who um, are what we would consider to be mildly mentally retarded, meaning that they would have a reading ability probably up to maybe fourth, fifth, or sixth grade levels as an adult. And then you can get to areas that are very profound mental retardation where an individual needs constant care. They cannot feed themselves, they cannot care for themselves as far as bodily waste. They cannot, you know, eliminate that in such a way that they could, kind of care for themselves. So it does have a very wide range. Some people who are mildly mentally retarded can live very independently, where others may need constant care for the rest of their lives, and in some cases may need to live um, in kind of a hospital setting to receive that. When we talk about giftedness, these are those people who are typically above 130 on the IQ scale. And they also have some unique features. I mean, as far as their needs as well, and on a social level, both groups can be very awkward. So as we go along, we're going to talk a little bit about each of these, kind of in general here. Talking about mental retardation, typically this is how people would have seen it as individuals who are significantly sub-average intelligence that becomes apparent before the age of 18, meaning that they have limitations in at least two of these areas of communication, self-care, home living, social skills, community use, self-direction, health and safety, um, functions of academics, and leisure and work. But one of the things that we know about mental retardation is that it can have a couple different causes. It can have a genetic cause, which sometimes is unknown to couples before they conceive, such as Down syndrome and such. And then there are environmental factors, fetal alcohol syndrome, sometimes even certain accidents, or just the whole concept of deprivation and negligence can lead to mental retardations. Um, when families kind of know that there's an issue, and a lot of times there's testing and screening that happens um, during a child's prenatal stage of development. Sometimes families can start preparing for these situations. So, like for example, with Down syndrome, there's blood screening that can be done fairly early on into pregnancy, and if families know that this is going to happen, they can start preparing and working with um, therapists to give that individual, the best start possible. There's other forms like PKU, which is um, kind of a birth disorder that is kind of hidden, but yet at the same time can be prevented by a special diet. And so if there is screening there and families know what's going on here, they can kind of prepare um, for it by treating it with that diet as well. We have special education programs that can kind of help individuals as far as trying to strive to learn a vocational skill or to live independently. There's therapies, sensory stimulation, social interaction. All these kind of things can be very helpful for those people that are in that population. Giftedness, Terman, Lewis Terman, who kind of brought us that Stanford Binet intelligence test, he did a longitudinal study at Stanford University, and he studied a group of over 1,500 children who had scored near the top of the IQ range. And what was interesting is over the years that he followed these individuals, and he followed them well into their middle ages, that many of these young people excelled in school. They also had very good health and they were happy. Um, as they moved into their adult lives, um, the study basically states that more than 86% of the men had entered high status professions, but no one was ever at the IQ level of, let's say, an Einstein. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a high IQ that you're guaranteed um, super success within this world. And you're not really even guaranteed wealth or stature, but at the same time that you could live a very distinguished life, as you go along. Okay. Families that have children who are kind of labeled as being gifted, one of the things that, parents have to be careful about is that their overzealousness can sometimes destroy the spark of curiosity that some of these young people have. Um, Parents have to be cautious not to make their children feel like they're a freak because they have these really profound gifts of intelligence. Nor at the same time should a parent, kind of be, smug about having a child who's very, very intelligent. That can also have a reverse effect as well. A high IQ is also no guarantee for having a high level of motivation. So it is kind of a slippery slope that parents have to navigate if they have a child who comes into this category. All right. Thank you very much.